We cannot force people to vote for parties they don't trust, in a system they don't believe in. Voting is best left as a choice, and not voting is a legitimate form of political expression that our side wants to protect. This is our policy for today. We believe that voting during any sort of election should be best left to the choices of the citizen. We will allow him to cast no votes or to cast a blank vote. We will also try as far as possible to increase convenience for voters, such as increasing the number of polling stations, increasing the number of voting hours people can go and vote, and increasing the convenience of registration for voters before they can vote. The criteria for today's debate is simple. Both sides must prove why either forms of voting best protects democracy and creates the most effective and representative government, and creates better political parties before and after the election. Our side will forward 3 constructive arguments today. First of all, I will talk about why we best protect not voting as a legitimate form of political expression. Second of all, why our side creates a more fair and more informed system.
Point of information.
No, thank you. My second speaker will tell you why we increase the quality of political campaigning before the election. First argument on why not voting is a legitimate form of political expression. Let's first establish what it means to vote for a political party. There are 2 things we want to talk about. Firstly, for voters, it means it is an endorsement and trust you place in a party to potentially either form a government, no thank you, or to form a strong form of opposition in parliament. More importantly, secondly, we think it means that they adequately represent your views as a person and the policies you believe should be passed in parliament after this political party gets elected. Not voting means that the parties during the election and during the campaigning period simply don't fulfill the above 2 criteria that we have set up. It therefore becomes, no thank you, an expression of dissatisfaction with the system and the parties as a whole. We think this happens very often because large parties that exist in many systems are often not representative of those people. For example, in the United States of America, the political system is dominated by Republicans and Democrats. The voters' view don't always fit into the polarized view of these 2 parties, simply because one end of the spectrum you have liberal policies, but people might not be liberal in every single aspect, like African Americans who believe in the welfare state but are also religiously conservative. This means that more often than not, a lot of people are disillusioned with the system because only the large parties dominate the system and only the large parties have the funding and support run in constituencies. They therefore choose not to vote in this system because there is no party that really represents them. Also, beyond just how the parties disillusion the voters because they don't represent their views, the whole system also makes people unhappy with it. Because more often than not, the incumbents and the larger parties try as far as possible to abuse the system, to tailor the system towards their advantage. They do things like gerrymandering, like redrawing electoral boundaries to ensure that more often than not, the outcome in a certain area is already predetermined before they've actually voted. A lot of voters are already aware of this, that the proportion of voters that are opposite your political viewpoint has already been predetermined. This is presented in the form of evidence, like the USA Congress. The United States Congress has a really high re-election rate, which means that they have a very safe seat back in their home district. It's 97%, but their approval rating is only 20%. This shows how many people, despite getting voted, don't actually represent the real will of the district. And it's only through gerrymandering that they have managed to prop up a huge, substantial amount of proportional votes. Therefore, we think people are disillusioned with the system as a whole. Even if side opposition might tell us there are other ways to express dissatisfaction, we don't think we should limit the ways you express dissatisfaction with the system.
Sir.
Hold on for a moment, sir. And our side protects all these forms. We also think that not voting is one of the strongest forms of expressing dissatisfaction with the system. Yes?
60% of Swiss voters didn't turn up for the latest national election. Are all of them against democracy?
No, sir. I never once said they are against democracy. But in the forms of voting that take place in the system, we think they are skewed towards certain parties, and we think that voters' concerns are not always taken care of. They need to show us why in these systems, voters can and should believe in the systems. What happens when instead voting is compulsory? We think it compromises on political expression because people are robbed of a way to express dissatisfaction with the system. More often than not, people tend to vote for the party they least disagree with and the party they least dislike. We think the corollary to this, the end point of this, is that the party being voted into government, more often than not, is not representative of the people's views in parliament, because it's just a few views that people agree with, but a lot of other views aren't being agreed with.
Point of information. information.
This creates a lot of long-term harm and political obstruction. For example, in Turkey, people really disagreed with the incumbent government now, but they still voted them in because they agreed with the other views, while every other political party was unpalatable to them. But today we see massive political protests and disruption against the party because as a whole, they don't really like this party but are forced into voting this party as a whole. We shouldn't force people to vote and create such long-term harm. Second argument about how we create a more fair and informed system as a whole. We have two tiers under this substantive. First of all, let's examine what happens when we force people like the uninformed to vote. This debate is really about people who wouldn't have voted otherwise, because people who vote anyway would be covered under both sides' policy. But first of all, let's just establish this. We try as far as possible to create informed votes in the system. Because yes, informed votes are the greatest approximation of a more representative view. Like if I cast an informed vote, I can best expect the government or the eventual party to represent my views. It is also the greatest approximation of the best policies in parliament that is legislated for the rest of society. That's why we want to create more, as far as possible, more informed votes. But in compulsory voting, those who vote anyway will vote their way. But it is those who wouldn't have voted in an optional system that we're really care about, because these people are either apathetic or they're really uninformed about the policies. This has a few implications. Firstly, we think it's unfair to these voters because they were apathetic and they didn't really vote for the party they wanted. It is either out of convenience or they simply voted for a party that was the incumbent or the most showy, because these parties gain the most airtime and grab the most attention to you. They cannot, for a moment, sir, they cannot be held accountable to their views because they didn't really make an active choice. It was a forced choice and a false choice to vote for these parties. Yes?
If I knew I had to vote, wouldn't I be more likely to find out more about the parties before I cast that vote?
Sir, no. The intrinsic reason why they were apathetic to begin with is because they don't really care about the political system or they are disillusioned. They might very well know about these parties, but they don't really care because they don't like the system. You need to show us why people will take active steps. But beyond that, I'm going to further rebut that point of information by showing you why more often than not, they won't actually take the time to actively involve themselves in the political system. Because the political system works this way. Right after you vote in a certain party, it doesn't mean that your involvement ends there. It also means that you have to continually engage your member of parliament, tell them to pass certain policies you like. But we don't think these people who are already disillusioned or apathetic about the system will go on to actively involve themselves in the political system to ensure that the MPs pass policies that are representative and beneficial to them. And that's why our side increases the significance of informed voters who actually care and actually believe that the policies influence them, rather than to let people who don't care and don't want to do anything about it to dilute the significance of the voters who actually care and are important. The second tier is we want to improve the signalling in this system, because in a compulsory voting system, large proportions of votes often signal to political parties that they have huge amounts of support. We think this is a misleading idea, and we want to ensure that political parties actually work hard to appeal to everyone in order to increase their support. And for all these reasons, our side better ensures a democratic system and better ensures effective and representative government. Go with side proposition.
Opposition believes that governments should be of all the people, by all the people, and for all the people. And to that end, we're going to have two-pronged policy. First of all, we support policies that make voting in national elections compulsory, which means that if you don't want to turn out to vote, the government can strike off your name on the electoral roll and levy punishments upon you like fines. Specific punitive measures will be left up to individual jurisdictions to decide. Two, we agree with our first speaker. We support any other policies or measures that are targeted at making the voting process easier, like measures like putting polling stations in centralized areas and making public transport free at the day of polling. So we agree with the measures that they will adopt on their side. There is a strong track record of success in nations like Belgium, which has the highest voter turnout in the whole of Europe. I'm going to run two key rebuttals before I launch into our constructive material. First, about this whole idea about political expression, and second, about this idea that they encourage more informed voters. First, about this whole idea of political expression. They told us that your vote represents your personal interest, so if democracy has failed you, you can just not turn up. No thank you. No, we disagree with their premise entirely. Your vote serves a dual purpose. First, to represent you as an individual, but second, also to select the best government that can benefit as many people as possible. No thank you. That's why we compel them to turn out, so we can have governments which people are willing to vote in is elected We don't think a government with 30% of the mandate of people will be the best possible government and the best kind of buy-in from the people. We think that's exactly what generates the kind of disenchantment that they are talking about. We can force you to vote because the vote also serves in electing a best government for the people, not just the individual interest. Now, the second thing it told us here is that sometimes you disagree with the specific system of voting entirely because the existing structures are skewed like gerrymandering. So first of all, this exists on both sides of the house. So the more nuanced question to ask is, which side best ameliorates this problem? What sends a more powerful signal? People who don't turn up, where oppressive parties can point to them and say they didn't turn up because of a whole myriad of reasons, maybe because it was raining on polling day, for instance, or people who do turn up and cast sports votes to show their dissatisfaction against the skewed systems of gerrymandering, the skewed systems of policy. It's not whether about individual interest against gerrymandering. This exists on both sides. The question is which side best ameliorates this problem, and it's clearly side opposition. The second key point they raised to us here was this whole idea about informed voters. The only politically active voters will ever be interested in finding out more about parties. They presented incredibly monolithic analysis here. I'm going to break it down for you. First, politically apathetic voters. Now, we tell you that the reason why they don't know enough about the political system is because they don't have any incentive or they don't have any compulsion to vote in the first place. So if I would rather stay at home and watch TV, my incentive structure is skewed towards not finding more about the party in general. But when we create a situation where individuals are put under a position where they have to vote anyway, we think they'll make the best of this situation because they think that their vote can actually influence government policy in some way. So for this class of people, we think on our side, we are comparatively better. No, thank you. The second group of people are people who disagree with the democratic system entirely. We think that forcing them to vote is still better because at least at the ballot box, they can either cast a sport vote or vote for the party that they feel best aligns with their interests, even though it may not be exactly representative of what they stand for. So even on that level, we think informed voting still happens. But in effect, we disagree that the most passionate voters also tend to be the most informed. It is the most hardcore Republicans and the most hardcore Democrats that know the least about politics because they tend to vote along party lines. They don't even know who's representing them in a local election or a national election, for instance, because they just vote if you say things like, Christ supports me, it's all behind me, and I'm going to vote for the Republicans. We don't think that premise even stands. We're going to forward 3 key lines of argument here. I'm going to fold this idea about a signal into my second argument. First, about how outside upholds democracy. Second, how we fine-tune the specific signal of the vote. And finally, in our second speaker, how outside improves political engagement. First, we uphold democracy. I'm going to start from a base question. What makes democracy special? Democracy is the only system of governance where the collective will of the people is a key factor in influencing a nation's government. This means that democracy is premised on active political participation, where the voices of as many individuals, if you give me a moment, are represented because everyone has a say in government. We cannot have a scenario where only 40% of the electorate turns out in Switzerland, where half the nation is being represented in parliament and half their voices are heard at the ballot box. But before I go on, yes sir?
Why do I have a duty to vote for a party that doesn't represent me, when not voting can clearly force parties to accuse me?
Because there's a collective action problem here. If you feel that your party doesn't accurately represent you, you're just going to stay at home and hope that the rest of the electorate is going to vote for the right government. But when you think governments levy upon you duties on your individual liberty all the time to serve a greater national good in electing the most representative government. That's why, for instance, governments tax you in order to pay for the paving of roads, because they realize that although individually you may not have an incentive to go pave those roads, a greater national benefit will accrue. So we think governments can force you to spend half an hour of your time voting. Back to my argument. What happens when voting is optional? It perverts democracy from being a mechanism in which everyone has a say in the state to being something you can merely opt into. There exists a serious collection action problem, as I've already proven to you. So we think that when you extrapolate this mentality across an entire nation, we observe plummeting voter turnout across the board. We're not just talking about individuals who may be disenchanted with democracy, we're also talking about individuals who may be politically apathetic or just staying at home because it happens to be raining on polling day. So we don't think in any case, ladies and gentlemen, that we should enable governments to be put into power with such a limited mandate. Why is this particularly bad? Because on our side, we resolve such a collective action problem when we use the tool of the legislation to ensure that democracy remains truly representative. But before I go on, yes ma'am?
If I don't vote because I find it too inconvenient to turn up at the polling station, how is your side going to make me more informed and incentivize me to read about the political campaigns that go on every day?
Thank you, sir. Because political parties have an incentive to appeal to the presumed electorate. So if they know that everyone in the electorate is going to be voting, they're going to increase visibility in areas they previously said, alright, only 20% of voters actually turn out in that district, so they're going to ignore them or spend less time on them. Now, parties have an incentive to appeal to as many groups as possible under our paradigm, which is comparatively far better for representation and engagement than your side. Back to my argument. So we best reflect the interests of as wide a cross-section of people as possible, and governments have a duty to do so. And this applies especially in fledgling democracies where there is a lack of buy-in, and it's even more important to engender faith. Second argument, about we fine-tune the specific signal of the vote. We begin from the premise that your vote does not solely act as a means through which you select a government, but also a signal to inform policy making. Because the breakdown of votes you vote for indicate how an electorate feels regarding key issues. You know how many people voted with them, for instance, so the Labour Party can tweak its party platform to get more voters from them. What does this mean? It's incredibly important because all governments make decisions on such a presumption which is informed by the results of an election. What happens when voting is optional? There are a myriad of reasons why people don't vote, as I've already explained. So what happens then? It means that governments limit your individual liberty to serve a greater national good. Why? Because the ballot box is grossly inaccurate in informing government policy on their side. Because now it's split into people who voted for a specific party, some spoiled votes, and a whole chunk of people who didn't even turn up. At best, this means government policy making are skewed towards groups that actually turned up because they're unable to determine who actually didn't turn up and can't fit an unknown demographic. At worst, this is misinformation and it severely hampers a government's ability to appeal to an electorate and craft specific policies for all its people. On the comparative, our set reflects the full range of views and enables more specific policy making. You can determine whether someone is truly disenchanted with a political system when they spoil their vote, or someone is simply unwilling to stand in the rain. Sure, we lose some specificity between turning up and spoiling your vote versus not turning up at all. But we think on the comparative, we gain the specificity of 30% of your entire population. So we think on the comparative, we are willing to absorb that lack of specificity. Please go with side opposition.
Democracy isn't about asking people to fulfill their duties to the government. Democracy is about the government, the person and the party with the most resources to empower you with all the choices that you can make. And that is what we firmly stand for. That's what they miss. 2 points of contention today. Firstly, the whole idea of political expression and the principles of democracy. And secondly, who really solved the problem of uninformed voters and uninformed choices. Let's first look at the first point of contention, the whole idea of political expression. The first argument they brought forth to us is that votes serve a dual purpose, that they represent you. But we say, how do you actually gain the mandate of people, for example, who turn in spoiled votes? How do you ensure that these people are actually being represented? Because they are saying that they don't want any party to represent them. They are saying they don't want to make a choice. So we think it's principally inconsistent on their side when they say they allow for spoiled votes. And we think that it's even more harmful when they allow for spoiled votes. Why? Because that means that the people who actually do care about politics and do care about the best party representing them are going to be at a disadvantage. Because it means that a significantly less proportion of votes are going to be informed votes. There's going to be a dilution of what the people actually want. And that's what they miss. That's why we cannot allow for spoiled votes. But even if we agree that spoiled votes, are acceptable and that, they serve the same purpose as not turning up for an election or not turning up for the ballot box, then why not just allow these people to not turn up for the ballot box? Because we think it's a far stronger political statement when you don't even turn up to vote in the first place. This signals to the government that the people really are that disillusioned and forces them into acting, which is what I'll cover in my substantive. They have not even dealt with Elvis's substantive, that this is a legitimate political statement, and that we need to keep these kinds of legitimate political statements because it's what people choose democracy for. It's why people are engaged in democracy. Because democracy recognizes that you need to empower them with all the tools in the toolbox, not just some. But finally, when we talk about the whole idea of democracy in Chiri's substantive, let's talk about why they don't have the correct argument of democracy. We do agree that there's a certain curtailment of rights in democracy, for example, when you have to pay taxes. But to the point where you curtail all your rights until it becomes a meaningless choice, that we don't think that people are going to feel that they have to participate in democracy anymore. We think rather that once again, democracy is always about empowering the people, and this is how you appeal to people who don't have a faith in democracy in the first place. Before I move on, yes ma'am.
Tell me how getting voters to go down to the polling stations and vote for the government they feel best represents them is curtailing all their rights.
Once again, what we said is that you get rid of a very strong political statement that can only be made when you allow these people their choice. Therefore, it's a unique and a legitimate option. You need to deal with this. You can't just say that you're going to allow for spot votes, as I said in my analysis. Let's look at my second point of contention. Who actually improves the idea of informed voters and informed choices? So they're saying that, in a situation where all people have to vote, suddenly we're going to be magically interested in political discourse every day, just because you have to turn up one day at the polling station. No, we think that in order for you to make an informed choice, you actually need to be interested in weeks or months of political campaigning and asking everybody in your society to actually be interested in the discourse is going is a bit too much, and it's going to be hard to really enforce. So we don't think that we're actually going to have a lot of informed choices, especially considering you're talking about people who rather not go to the ballot box because they're going to be inconvenienced. What makes you think that suddenly they will change their minds and start being politically aware? We think it's not going to happen magically. But secondly, we think your side is worse because it increases the resentment against democracy. You're saying that, we want to force you to vote even though you don't want to. This means that, well, obviously, even if there's no unjustified curtailment of your rights, the people will perceive that you are infringing on their rights. And this is especially bad to people who don't have faith in democracy, as you stated in the first place. So we don't think so. But I'm going to prove to you in my substantive why we actually get informed choices better by proving to you that we improve the quality of political campaigning. So, under our policy, what we're essentially doing is placing the onus not only on the system to attract voters to come to the ballot box, but placing the onus on the parties. Why is this good? Because now it's not simply enough to be the lesser of a few evils and attract votes using that. Because people are not going to turn up just because one option is worse than the other. People are only going to turn up when that option, your party, is the absolute best choice that you will actually urge you to turn up at the ballot box and vote. Before I move on, just one here.
Why won't this apply if voters can just spoil their votes as well?
How many times do I need to repeat my argument? We think that it's a unique and legitimate statement when you don't turn up, because of the fact that voter turnout rates are still actually calculated. And when the government sees that people are actually not interested in voting, maybe there's something wrong with the system. Maybe you do need to change the system. And that's only how you actually realize that something really needs to be done. More on that later in my substantive. Because you need to present yourself as the absolute best option, so people will actually take the time to turn up just to vote for you. We think that politics are going to improve in two ways. Firstly, let's look at the nature of discourse. We think that nature of discourse is not only going to be driven by antagonism now, because it's not enough, for example, to mudsling a certain side or say that a certain side is worse. So you don't have cases like the Workers' Party or the SDB in Singapore where compulsory voting, where they simply criticize the incumbent but not come up with policies themselves which are attractive enough to actually attract people to go to the ballot box. This means that parties always have an incentive to improve themselves, always look at the way they're campaigning and the way they actually craft their policies and make it such that they improve and make it such that they're always attractive to everybody around them, while also differentiating them from other parties. Secondly, we think that we also improve the content of the discourse, because people are now going to talk about the most relevant issues. Certain parties are not going to be able to hide behind issues that they traditionally win with because of the fact they can attract swing demographics, because they need to ensure that everybody actually turns up to the ballot box and casts an absolute vote for them. This means they need to talk about the most relevant issues that are relevant to everyone in society. And this also means that they need to talk about these issues with sufficient depth in order to actually attract people to listen to these kinds of issues on a daily, on a monthly basis. So because of these reasons, because of the fact that we have better quality of campaigning, how do we ensure that we have more votes that are informed? Firstly, we say that in cases where people are apathetic, maybe when they look at how parties are actually trying to improve themselves and actually trying to attract your vote and your time, these people will be more willing to listen to the political discourse that's actually in play. So that's how we actually ensure that we engage with apathetic voters, not robbing them of any certain right, but tell you that the parties are going to do something about it. And the second thing, even if these kinds of apathetic voters still don't turn out, then at least the political discourse is still going to be of a better quality. That means for those people who are going to vote based on who best represents them, at least they get a better sense of why these kinds of parties represent them and why these kinds of parties can enact policies that are going to benefit the nation. Because of all these reasons, I can stand here and firmly say that our side better understands that the principles of democracy are to work for the people and not to get them to work for you.
Side proposition had two things to say. First, that government is about serving the people. You agree? But in order to do that, they first need to know what all of the people want. Second, that not voting is a unique political expression. And we think it is unique only insofar as it is one of the few tools of political expression that is extremely generic and non-specific. I'm going to deal with that case in two rebuttals. First of all, why don't people actually vote? Second of all, which side leads to better outcomes? First, why don't people actually vote? And this was side proposition tried to tell us that it's a strong political statement. But we think it's very telling that in their first speaker they consider people don't vote not because they're against democracy, but because they've got specific problems with that particular system of voting which they have. Precisely, the whole system of democracy is meant to self-correct. That's what my first speaker told you, it's so that democracy is special, it's the only system where voters can self-correct their own form of government. No thank you. I think the problem with not turning up is that because they've given us so many reasons why people may choose not to turn up, it's an incredibly generic and non-specific way of telling people which specific problems you have with that system. So because you don't know what their specific grievances are when they simply don't turn up, it's actually much harder for you to correct the problems with that particular system which you have in mind. I think on these grounds alone, a lot of their argumentation has fallen. No thank you. Let's go into specific reasons they had for why people might not show up. First, they said they may disagree with all of the parties, therefore they don't turn up. We think if you don't agree with all of the parties, all of the big parties, you can spoil your vote, which still indicates you don't agree with any of them quite clearly. Second of all, you can vote for a much smaller party. They haven't shown us why, to show your disagreement with different parties, you must not show up as opposed to a spoiled vote. We think instead of not showing up, ignores the specific grievances with the parties. Second, they said the systems are gerrymandered, incumbents have an advantage. We think the response to that which voters will go up can use specifically is to vote against the incumbent or simply to vote for another party or to spoil their vote once again. In fact, we think with compulsory voting it's much better. Why? Because when all the disillusioned people with the incumbent show up and vote against the incumbent, he's far more likely to lose his seat than if all of them just stayed at home. Once again, it's the collective action problem my first speaker told you about, which they still haven't come back to. Once again, more important, it's a specific grievance which we are signaling, not the generic grievance of not showing up, where you're not sure if I'm disagreeing with all of the parties or I'm disagreeing with the system or gerrymandering itself. No thank you. Finally, it's a curtailment of your rights. We have told you this happens all of the time. More importantly, it's not a meaningless choice to vote. We think it's precisely the problem on their side when they paint the vote as a meaningless choice that people are disillusioned and people are disenfranchised with the system. Yes.
Can't these kind of people make the vote simply for the most showy party or simply the incumbent because they really don't care about the political discourse?
Look, first you tell us they don't care because they disagree because they don't like the gerrymandering and the incumbent. Now you tell us they just don't care about political discourse. Precisely, on your side, both of these sets of people will not show up. It's not specific. Whereas on our side, one group will vote against the incumbent, the other group will spoil their vote. That's far more specific. Next point about why we have better outcomes on our side. Let's first examine voters. Think that a group of voters who vote anyway, and they haven't dealt with argumentation very often. These are the least informed voters who just vote along party lines because that's what their grandparents and their parents do. Second, people who wouldn't vote. And this is where the bulk of their analysis has tried to appear. They said, if I wouldn't vote, then I would not bother to find out any information at all. No, because let's examine the calculus of someone who's choosing not to vote. They're choosing not to vote because they think, you know what, I don't really care enough to go down. And since I'm not going to vote anyway, I might as well not bother about finding out anything at all. When you force them to go down, when you force them to actually cast a vote, they're far more likely to at least take some interest in that particular vote because they know it could potentially have an impact. More importantly, the idea of parties which they brought up. We think first of all, We think, first of all, spoiling the votes will tell parties the same thing as well, as I pointed out, therefore all of the benefits fall. Second of all, non-conventional parties like the Five Star Alliance or like Imran Khan in Pakistan do the same function of opposing the existing parties and political system. This can happen as well. Finally, we give parties an incentive to outreach to voters who previously had low turnout. We don't think they've done with that point. I'm going to transition now to my point of substantive about how we improve political engagement. So, why? No thank you. Because we give parties an incentive to appeal to all sectors of society. We think some sectors of society, generally the disadvantaged sectors, are far less likely to vote. The poor, people living in slum areas. Crucially, this isn't because they repudiate democracy or they don't like it, but because the barriers to their vote are greater and they believe that their vote won't make much of a difference. For example, in the slums in Detroit, voter turnout drops by as much as a third if polling day happens to be on a day with rain. The problem is that it's a self-reinforcing issue when parties look at these areas and say, these are areas with low voter turnout, therefore it makes more sense for me to use my resources for campaigning in other areas instead. But before I move on, yes.
A lot of these voters are either uneducated or unmotivated. How will voting, making them vote, actually make them turn up in the first place?
Are you suggesting that just because people are uneducated, therefore they can't vote properly? We think that's a very dangerous line to take. We don't accept that at all. More importantly, we think therefore it reduces the outreach of parties to these low voter areas and makes them even more disenfranchised and less likely to vote. When we make voting compulsory, we give parties a massive incentive, no thank you, to appeal to the disadvantaged. Why? Because now they know that their resources and their campaigns won't be wasted on an area where half the voters don't even show up. So they know this is the captive vote base which they need to go for. This makes parties represent the most vulnerable people in our society. For example, after Iceland made voting compulsory in 2002, parties like the People's Liberation Front began reaching out to disadvantaged communities around poorer regions like Drakeridge and Oost-Harlem. And this led them to institute more progressive policies which help the poor. Therefore, compulsory voting means more outreach to disadvantaged groups in our society, increasing their political engagement. This is especially important in fledgling democracies where many people lack faith in the new government. And this deals with the argument they brought up about resentment as well. Why? We think especially in such countries of fledgling democracies where many rural areas suffer from low turnout, no thank you, and where parties are far more likely to appeal to populations in urban cities and urban areas. This leads to far more disenfranchisement in rural areas where they see that the new system of government of democracy, no thank you, is not reaching out to them and is not dealing with their needs. We think when parties reach out to them as a result of compulsory voting, where they recognize that rural voters are more likely to vote and therefore their votes are more likely to count, rural voters feel far more included and invested in the democracy and the new system of government which they have. We think that this is incredibly important. Why? Because it is precisely in fledgling democracies where the faith and support of voters in large rural regions where government control might not be as strong as it is in existing democracies, where it's this sort of support and faith that sustains democracies in the most important way. Therefore, by making voting compulsory, not only do we increase political engagement and representation of the most disadvantaged groups in our society, we also thus build more faith in fledgling democracies, allowing them to be more sustainable. Therefore, we believe that the system of compulsory voting not only serves all of the people, but also serves all of the nations in this debate, and that's why we're incredibly proud to stand in opposition.
Let's ask two simple questions in today's debate. First of all, is compulsory voting aligned with democratic principles? And secondly, how do we produce better governance? On to the first question. Is compulsory voting aligned with democratic principles? And here we're going to deal with the strongest objection side opposition has provided us with today, that governments can sometimes limit autonomy for a greater good. We agree, which is why the real question of the debate is the extent to which this autonomy can be curtailed. And here we're going to break the deadlock by telling you why this isn't the case under voting. Why is this so? Because we respect that in any democracy, a curtailment of your individual liberty only matters insofar as it's actually a meaningful curtailment, such that it actually enables the further actualization of the self. What does this mean? This means that, for instance, taxes are perfectly fine because by taking away a small bit of my wealth, these go into the building of social infrastructure which ultimately enable me to live in a much safer and secure society. In that sense, a small curtailment on my part better actualizes me in the long run, so that curtailment is a meaningful one. How is this not the case in voting? Because of what we've provided you on our side of the house, that not voting is a legitimate and specific and unique form of political expression. Any sort of curtailment that side opposition wants to tell us about, which is about casting either a blank vote or about having to participate in the system at all, erodes the significance and uniqueness of this political expression. As a result, this curtailment results in a meaningless form of democracy that doesn't stay true to what democracy really is about. But conversely, we think that it's really the government's duty to ensure that people feel enough about issues raised in political debates such that they want to vote. And the way you do it is not by compelling and forcing people to vote. Why is this the case? Because people vest power in their governments by voting them in. Consequently, we think it's the government's duty to ensure that people feel engaged enough to want to turn up to vote. But we're going to provide you with a last tier to this analysis, which is that even if we accept that the government is the one who has provided me with benefits to live in the society I currently live in today, it doesn't mean that I have a reciprocal duty to uphold my end of this bargain. Why is this the case? Because governments chose to provide me with the benefits and social infrastructure as well as services. I didn't necessarily promise to fulfill my end of the duty by voting, by participating in the democratic framework which I might not even have consented to in the first place. And because of all these reasons, we've provided you with the analysis about how this curtailment of autonomy is a very unjustified one. But here we'd like to bring up the idea of how not voting is a legitimate form of political expression, to which my earlier speakers have told you that existing political parties might be inadequate. For example, in the heavily polarized context of the United States, where people who fall in the middle of the political spectrum feel that neither side really caters to what they really stand for. Here they told us that voters can then cast spoil votes. In that case, we think there's no functional difference. But just because there are other options for me to signal my dissatisfaction with the system doesn't mean that I should have one less option to do so. They haven't provided us with a positive reason why it's okay to take away this option. But more importantly, we've told you that sometimes, no thank you, that it's a unique form of political expression, because it's not just about me casting a blank vote. Now it's about me rejecting the whole system entirely. Here we're going to deepen the analysis, that these people who reject the system entirely are going to be the ones who are resentful when you even remove their choice and force them to vote in the very first place. And this is even worse because you make them disillusioned with the entire system. It's a system which forces you and locks you in even when you clearly want to break free and out of it. But last of all, on this point, we're going to suggest that the overarching basis of any democracy is that of agency and representation. And not voting is a form of political expression which best keeps true to these goals and aims of political representation, which ultimately results in the furtherance of democracy. Before I go on, yes sir.
Some people don't show up because they dislike the mainstream parties. Some think the system is gerrymandered. Some think democracy as a whole should be rejected entirely. Why is not showing up going to show all of these different specific grievances in a unique fashion?
Sir, our answer is simple. The outside is much comparatively better. On your side of the house, where people are forced to take part in the system, none of these reasons get represented. On our side, we think it's clearly evident when people choose not to turn up that they feel that the system has failed them, and in that sense, we don't think your point stands. So on that count, we've proven that it's true to democratic principles that we keep voting optional. On to the second question. How do we ensure better governance? Here we're going to deal with voter apathy. And here we're going to deal with more nuanced fashion inside opposition. Because we accept that some people might not vote because they feel like the system has failed them. But for some, they simply can't be bothered. We argue that for this group of people, it's especially harmful when you compel them to vote. Why exactly is this the case? Because they'll make uninformed votes. Here we're going to provide you with a very nuanced analysis that these people will want to cast a vote and not spoil their votes. Why exactly is this the case? Because they feel like they want to maximize the value of the vote, which they already have to cast anyway. At the same time, they're unlikely to take or to religiously, for example, read the papers every day and find out what every single political party stands for. Find out all the different track records and history of what every single political party has done, because that is far too time-consuming. And if it's precisely these people who will only have voted only because they had no other choice, we think it's very unlikely that they're going to take the effort to find out exactly in great depth what exactly each political party stands for. What is the end outcome of this uninformed voting? That people either vote for incumbent governments for no other reason than the fact that they simply think there's no one else to vote for, or they vote for the most showy party. And we think it's harmful. Why exactly is this the case? Because you might have more votes, but ultimately these votes are less representative. These votes mean less when they're ultimately less representative, and because people don't truly keep these issues close to their heart. These are not the interests that people really prioritize. So ultimately, you're allowing such uninformed voters to ensure ensure that governments who are elected are unrepresentative, and this is particularly damaging because it has nationwide repercussions on the entire country. But here we're going to deal with the worst case scenario on our side, where we might accept that we have overall lower voter turnouts, but we think this is still better than side opposition. Why exactly is this the case? Because the votes that are actually cast are far more meaningful. They are cast by the people who will actually remain engaged with the system and support, or for example, contribute to the discourse when it comes to policies that need to be implemented. These are the people who truly feel for the issues that they do vote for. And ultimately, we think it's better that we allow maybe perhaps a slightly smaller group, but more representative and more engaged group to vote on basis of the national issues, because these are likely to be the ones who are more informed anyway. So even in the worst case scenario, we still think it's much better than what side of opposition has told us. In the second speaker, they told us about how we need to signal the specific grievances, which we really think is a strange point. Here we're going to do the comparative analysis. On their side of the house, there might be two dominant parties. But for example, on our side of the house, there might be two dominant parties, but each having a very low percentage of the votes. We think this clearly signals to the political parties that they need to engage their voters more. Consequently, on their side of the house, this value is diluted when each political party has a higher percentage of the votes, but only because people vote because they had no other choice to. And it's outside that better keeps the meaningful function and significance of the vote. But it didn't deal with my second speaker's argument about how you heighten the quality of campaigning. And this is what we told you, that now it's not just about being better than the next best political party, but also ensuring that the issues discussed are relevant enough such that people have an active reason to want to turn up at the polls anyway. We challenge the next speaker to deal with that. On the last point about accessibility and conditions in nascent democracies, we think nascent democracies are going to be the ones who prioritize autonomy the most and are going to most reject it when they have to when they're compelled to participate in a system that they don't even want to. But the end outcome on their side, when they have to settle between two equally substandard parties and result in poor governance, is that ultimately it's their side that causes people to lose faith in democracy. On that count, we've proven that we better ensure better governance, and our side sticks true to democratic principles. We are so proud to propose.
I'm going to ask two big questions for the floor today. Firstly, which side better upholds democratic principles? And secondly, which side better increases meaningful political engagement? And I'm going to show you how, on both these counts, side opposition takes this debate. First, let's look at the first big question, right? On which side better upholds democratic principles? The first point I'm going to deal with is on this whole idea that we shouldn't force people to vote because it's so-called undemocratic. But then they shifted their case in third, right? When they came up and told us that, it's the extent to which your autonomy is infringed on that's the problem, because, you should be able to self-actualize. First of all, we tell you that, well, in this case, we see that significant harm is caused when voters in a democracy choose not to vote, right? When they exercise this autonomy, this self-actualization, and decide not to turn up. Why? We tell you firstly that this undermines the whole concept of representation in democracy, right? When the existing government doesn't see that it has captured the views of an entire demographic, of the entire population. So we tell you that it's undermined representation. The second thing we told you is that it undermines democracy as a concept, it undermines the people's faith in democracy, and it undermines the people's perceived bias. But before I move on, yes ma'am.
It's okay for me to pay taxes because that curtailment better fulfills my aims and actualization in the long run. In this case, the unique political expression is lost entirely.
Now we tell you, right, that by turning up to vote, by casting a vote in a certain way, by ensuring that your voice is captured by the democratic process, that is a benefit that accrues not just to society, but to democracy and to yourself as an individual voter, when governments have a greater incentive to appeal to each and every one of the voters in its electorate. We also tell you that it hurts governments in fledgling democracies, right, when it reduces the perceived buy-in. For example, when Belgium wanted to increase the faith in its new democratic system and thus made voting compulsory. But my extension to this is this, right? We think that it undermines the democratic mandate of the existing ruling party when you don't cast your vote. Why is this so? And why is this so important? We think that when a ruling party is empowered, for example, only 40% of the popular vote, that gives anti-government elements and extremist parties a lot of leeway to enhance their anti-government rhetoric, right? To say that you don't really have the legitimacy and the credibility to be in power. But on our side, when we ensure that governments are secured in their power with a popular mandate, with the will of the majority and reflection of the votes of the majority, we think this is what ensures better stability in a democracy by ensuring that parties have more legitimacy, more credibility. Most of all, right, we never assume duty because of reciprocity, right? And that renders Etuko's entire extension completely irrelevant. Second point of contention under this big question, right? On how whether it increases resentment or not. So they told us about how, it increases resentment because people feel locked in, they feel forced to make a choice. No, we don't think so, right? First of all, we don't think it's that significant an infringement on your rights to go down to a polling station, which will be be very accessible to you, which is not going to be in some random obscure corner of the universe to cast your vote for a government which will represent you. We don't think this is an infringement of a significant infringement of your rights. But most of all, we tell you that it won't lock people in, because the reason why a lot of voters are currently unengaged is because they are apathetic, is because they are lazy, right? They don't want to leave their homes to vote. They don't want to make the extra effort to vote because of the collective action problem that Chibi has already outlined to you right from first speaker. So we don't think we cause resentment. Third big point of contention under this question, right, on whether not voting is a legitimate form of political expression. We tell you that there is no special unique benefit that you accrue from not voting. Why is this so? We tell you that if you are disenfranchised with the system of democracy, you can go to the polls and you can cast a blank vote or a sport vote. If you don't like any of the parties in a democracy, you can cast a blank or sport vote. The only thing that they could tell us is that, you know what, not voting is an important way of expressing yourself too. No, it's not. Why is this so? Because when you cast a blank or sport vote, we ensure that we capture the people with real grievances, with real problems with the political system, right? And we eliminate the entire chunk of people who aren't voting simply because they can't be bothered to leave their homes and stand in the rain to go to a polling station. So we think that we ensure that we capture a more specific set of views that are more representative of the people. Because we tell you that democratic will is better represented in the votes that you cast say a lot more than if you don't cast them at all. We think that it's more important for us to ensure that everyone votes. More importantly, right, we tell you that it's important for political parties to understand the reasons for not voting as well. Because the political parties can get away with saying that they haven't gotten the majority support because people are too lazy to vote, because people are just uninterested, or because people are fine in the system. That takes away, that doesn't send them the signal that something is wrong with the government or something is wrong with democracy as a system, and therefore removes the impetus for them to reform, for them to change. Second big question, so I'll move on to my second big question, right, on whether which side better increases meaningful political engagement. The first point of contention I'm going to deal with is what happens when uninformed voters, but before I, hold on a moment, ma'am, uninformed or apathetic voters vote. But before I move on, yes, ma'am.
People may cast blank votes, but you have analysis that just because I have other options doesn't mean I should have one less.
Simply because, ma'am, by allowing people to not vote, you undermine the number of people who will use these more legitimate and more representative platforms to express their views. Because if you allow people the option of not voting, why would you go all the way to the system, to the polls, for example, to cast a vote if you're that uninterested? We think that by forcing people to go down to the polls, we understand whether they are really having a problem with the system or whether they just can't be bothered to leave their homes. So we think your entire argument on this falls. So let me move on, right, to what happens when uninformed or apathetic individuals vote. He's told us how, uninformed voters won't inform themselves because they won't read all, the entire newspapers leading up to the election. We tell you that you don't need to do all these extensive things in order to be an informed voter, right? We think most people in democracy don't necessarily do this, but they can still make an informed choice based on watching things like campaign videos. But more importantly, we tell you that under our side, voters are more likely to be engaged as opposed to when under your side, the government is basically saying, okay, you're an uninterested voter, we're not even going to make any effort to try and bring you into the democratic system. We think that by compelling everyone to come to the polls and by introducing everyone to the democratic process, ensuring that everyone has exposure to the voting system and the process by which their governments are formed, we think this is what makes them more informed. We think this gives them a greater incentive to acquaint themselves with the principles of democracy. After that, they told us how, they would just vote for the most showy party. First of all, we think you're placing a value judgment on the reasons why people make choices in a democratic system, right, which we don't think you have a right to do. We think people make decisions for their own reasons. So for example, if I choose to vote for the party that's currently in power, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm jumping on the bandwagon, right? That could mean that I'm fine with status quo, that I think the current government is doing a good job. And similarly, if I vote for a party that is small, that's on the fringes, that is extreme, what does that reflect? That doesn't necessarily reflect that I'm wasting my vote, right? That could reflect that I'm so dissatisfied and so unhappy with the current system that's doing such a poor job of reflecting my views and my rights as an individual voter that I see the need to do something radical at the polls to change that. All these are nuances that are never going to be captured if you allow voters to just sit at home and do nothing to contribute to the democratic process. So we think these votes under our system mean far more than when they are not cast. But on the second point of contention, right, on the increasing the quality of political parties campaigning, before I move on, yes, sir.
So if we can't judge, why are you saying that voting is more legitimate and more representative than not voting?
Because we tell you that when you don't vote, we cannot understand your views. We've already told you how there's a massive sense of vagueness and ambiguity in the reasons why you don't vote. And because your policy refuses to capture these nuances, we tell you you cannot possibly be more representative of the people. But let me deal with this whole point on increasing the quality of political parties campaigning, right? So the only thing that side proposition has brought to us is that, okay, political parties have incentive to step up their game, to appeal more to voters because they can't just count on being the least bad party. No, we don't think this is the case. case, right, we think that when you have compulsory voting, when you enforce every single person to vote, that encourages the party in power to not just rely on its existing voter base, right, to make an active effort to reach out to disenfranchised minorities who may not ordinarily have formed the crux of your voter turnout, but who are also an important part of your democracy, who can be ignored because parties in power can just feel safe with their existing voter bases. We think that when you force the entire country to come out and vote, this increases the willingness and the incentive of political parties to appeal to people across the spectrum, to appeal to people all over the nation, because ultimately these are the people that we want to represent with democracy, which is quite a substantive that they never dealt with. So ultimately, because our side believes in a system of democracy that is for all the people, by all, of all the people, by all the people, and for all the people, I'm very proud to oppose.
Democracy was meant to empower the people, not serve as an opt-in sham. Proposition would be content with governments in Afghanistan coming to power with a 10% mandate. Proposition would be fine if parties campaign solely to voters who would turn up and ignore those who chose to stay at home. Proposition would cripple democracy for the sake of an opinionated view. Two worlds exist in this debate today. The shrinking, confused dystopia of the proposition contrasted against the principled world of the opposition. The world of the proposition was one that started confident, that staying at home is always a unique form of expression, and it's so valuable that we can never ban it. But when faced with the fact that not turning up could be attributed to a whole host of reasons, proposition then redrew their world. They told us that it may be generic, but at least it allows anarchists and disillusioned people a voice. But again, when they realized that there are a range of existing alternatives to express dissent, tailored to the existing circumstances that individuals are facing, and that not voting sends an incredibly diluted message, proposition finally retreated to say that at least one more form of self-expression is important, abandoning all the unique analyses they provided in First Speaker. At the end of the day, it was a world that transformed into one that you should be allowed to do anything in the face of no harm. But even then, proposition chose to close one eye to the harms that we were talking about. They ignored the fact that unrepresentative governments sweep to power on the back of a weak mandate and tailor policies to benefit the existing electorate because of misinformation coming from the polls. They ignore the fact that there is ambiguous signaling, where everyone with some reason not to turn out is clumped into one group of voters who didn't vote in the election. They ignore the fact that they create preferential and harmful government campaign targeting as we presented in our second speaker. That is hard. Don't let the politicians and proposition lie to you. But the world of the opposition is one that was far more nuanced and far more principled. We recognized that given the diluted signal of not turning up and the range of reasons for not turning up, which they themselves considered in First Speaker, there was absolutely no unique benefit to be obtained. In our world, if I were an anarchist, Yan Jin was disillusioned, and Guan was just lazy, we had specific mechanisms to ensure that all our voices would be heard. I would cast a spot vote, Yan Jin would vote for the SDP, and Guan would just do more research. Here's the thing. Under proposition's model, we would all just not turn up. We think no signal is better than a poor signal that only results in more harms. That was the combined thrust of our entire 18 minutes of substantive material on our side today. We showed you how not turning up at the polls only needs governments to be unrepresentative of the people, only needs governments to skew the kind of policies that they were making, and only needs the policies that actually hurt people rather than help people who didn't turn up at the election. I told you in my first speech about the principles of democracy, that the important thing we have to understand about the democracy is that when mankind came together and decided that democracy was a great form of governance, they premised it upon the fact that active participation would occur, and that governments will be able to be representative of everyone who turned up at the ballot box. That's why it was so important, because representing only 40% of your people means that governments and political parties only ever had an incentive to campaign through that 40%, because they can assume that 60% won't turn up at the polls. Their magical idea of a swing vote won't turn up, because political parties had an incentive, as the second speaker told you, to appeal to the path of least resistance to ensure that they can still maintain in power. That was exactly what we told you, ignore down the line of proposition. At the end of the day, we recognized that democracy was for all the people, by all the people, and it should stay with all the people.
I'm going to break this debate down into two main issues. First of all, is compulsory voting democratic to begin with? Second, are there any benefits to compulsory voting that will compel us to believe it is good? So first of all, is compulsory voting democratic to begin with? Side opposition had a couple of things to tell us. First of all, they told us that voters have the duty to elect a government that is somehow representative of them, that it is acceptable to restrict our rights to not vote for any party because, look, you can just cast a blank vote. We just want you to go there in the first place. There are a few fundamental assumptions that our side identified in this argument. That in order to restrict people, to restrict their rights, you need to be able to justify it. You need to show us why there's some sort of inherent benefit to other people, maybe not a minority of people, but a large group of people, and that's why it's justified to restrict their rights. It also tries to further the actualization of our political rights, but we don't think these assumptions are true anyway. Let's deal with them one by one. First of all, the restriction of rights, as placed by my third speaker and second speaker, is a massive restriction of our political expression, and there is no benefit at all. Regardless of whatever reason they have, whatever reason they choose not to vote and to stay at home instead, we still think they're placing a value judgment on all of these people. Just because I value my home television time more than I value the next government that is going to be placed before me, doesn't mean their side can tell me I need to go and vote for a government, because that just isn't justified. We think this is especially pertinent if people don't actually believe in the system at all. Because guess what? This is actually a legitimate viewpoint for me. If I believe in, say, proportional representation, and the status quo is first past the post, it clearly means I don't believe in this system, and it means that I have a choice to vote for the alternative. Like my third speaker placed it, just because we have another choice, another party, smaller parties, doesn't mean I should be deprived of one last final choice, it is to not vote at all. And that is what is so important. Then the third speaker actually agreed with us when she said that we can't place a value judgment upon people. This essentially is a concession that governments and political systems cannot place value judgments on how we make our decisions, and their side, it doesn't seem to be logically consistent at all. Then let's deal with the entire idea that you can actually cast blank votes. Our side already had many responses to this that they never once dealt with. My second and third speaker insisted to you that there is no meaningful difference between casting a blank vote and not voting out. But beyond that, my third speaker also told you why it is the most powerful way to express dissent by simply not going to vote. By going to vote, you actually increase the voter turnout rates. The illusion for this is that there is an illusion of representation. You tell the incumbents and you tell the political parties that, look, 100% of people are interested in your policies. That isn't the picture. We would rather increase the sight of people unhappy. We would rather empty election centers where we tell people, look, your policies are terrible. No one wants to vote for them. We think there's a much more powerful message than simply casting a blank vote, because we don't think it's justified at all. And that's why we think their side doesn't actually protect people and doesn't actually protect the system of democracy. Second issue, are there actually any benefits? So this is where they told us that we want people to increase representation by voting, and we also increase minorities' views in public discourse. This simply isn't true. In the status quo, minorities are already being ignored. The most that their side can come up with is politicians giving you empty promises. Politicians promising you that we will increase welfare benefits for the poor. But afterwards, the only person they have to respond to is the rich lobbyist in Congress. There is no real minority representation on their side, and it isn't an argument on their side. But also, they fail to deal with our side's arguments about nascent democracies and how parties in nascent democracies are simply not ideal. I don't want to vote for an atheist party. I don't want to vote for an Islamist party. Whereas the middle ground, there is a lack of representation because large parties dominate the ground and small parties are scared to stand here. There is also a disjunct between representation and election into parliament, because people decide their stances even before decide their stances even before the election. People can't choose to influence party stances. And for all these reasons, we don't think that voting for any party in an election, if you don't believe in them, increases representation at all. At the end of the day, our side better protects representation and better protects democracy.
Okay, now that everybody's back, okay, I'm instructed to keep this as short as possible because we're already running a little late. Alright, so this debate was one of the debates that make you very happy as an adjudicator to get up very early in the morning, because both teams were very good in terms of their style. There was very good engagement on both sides, and in general, just one of those debates that really make you smile instead of compared to one of those that you really want to pull out all your hair. So on that note, I'd like to congratulate both teams again for a very good job.
Now that said, so I'll just address this as quickly as possible. Style, content, and strategy. So in terms of style, I think there were no problems here. We had very eloquent debaters who were very able, in fact more than able, to put across all their points and in a very convincing manner. In terms of content, now I think this was a particular issue in the debate. I think there was one side that was able to do a slightly better job in terms of relating the different examples to this debate to show its relevance and its application in the real world. Similarly, in terms of content, both sides did a marvelous job in terms of trying to develop their ideas, developing the different layers of analysis. But I think the side that was able to do a little bit better was to show how throughout all those different layers of analysis, that it went beyond just why do you think this would actually work in theory, but also in reality how this particular situation or that side's policy would actually play out. That said, this essentially boiled down to the last criteria, strategy, whereby both sides were very smart in the sense in deciding what point should have come up first at which different times. I think this was very good. But I think one side did a slightly better job in terms of trying to understand what the other team was trying to say, and subsequently taking that understanding in developing an argument which was very well suited and crafted to this debate. Now, having said that, this decision was close but clear to me, and so I shan't keep you in suspense any longer. The best speaker for this debate went to the first opposition. Like I said, in a very close but clear debate, the decision also went to the opposition.